Chapter 1 The Wedding of Ashes. The ivory veil itched against Sienna Vale's tear-streaked cheeks as the church doors swung open. Cameras flashed, guests rose, and soft violins played. A perfect wedding. But behind the silken flowers, everything stank of smoke. Her father's empire was nothing but blackened ruins now, reduced to ash by the man waiting at the altar. Cale Dravik. His name alone was a blade. He stood in a dark, tailored suit, sharp as a knife, his jaw carved in cold steel, his eyes like winter storms. The same hands that burned down her childhood now reached out to claim her. As she walked down the aisle, the lace on her gown whispered with every step, like dying flames. Everyone saw a fairy tale. She saw a war she'd already lost. The smell of scorched earth lived in her memory, gunpowder, blood, and the sound of her father's empire cracking like dry glass. When Cale's fingers brushed hers, the world didn't melt, it froze. The priest's voice was warm, soft, almost tender, like someone reading a bedtime story. But Sienna's pulse pounded too loud for words to land. "Do you take this man?" he spoke. She heard gunfire. She saw Cale dressed in black tactical gear leading the raid that turned everything she knew into smoke. She had been dragged out of a burning house that night, coughing, screaming for her father. Now that same man held a wedding ring, her wedding ring. She stared at the guests, faces dressed in silk and smiles, masks that pretended none of this was madness. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to look her in the eye. Her father had enemies. Cale had conquered them. And her, she was the crown. Not by choice, by conquest. She felt the weight of chains beneath her white gloves. Cale leaned closer, close enough for her to smell his cologne, rich, dark, intoxicating, the opposite of ash. "Say yes," he whispered, like an order disguised as a lover's plea. Sienna lifted her chin. Her throat burned with unshed screams. If she said no, she knew how this story would end. Another pile of ash, another name erased. He had power in every corner of this city. But if she said yes, she would be marrying the man who killed everything she loved. Her fingers trembled as she felt the cold metal of the ring. The violin swelled. The priest waited. Her knees felt weak, but her mind whispered something strange beneath the pain. If you marry your enemy, you sleep beside your war. And maybe, just maybe, that's where war can be undone. "I do," Sienna whispered, barely audible, but it was enough. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd like forced fireworks. Cale slid the ring onto her finger with the precision of a man who never made mistakes. When his lips brushed hers, the world went silent. No violin, no claps, just the sound of her heart breaking. She closed her eyes, and behind them, the fire replayed in brutal detail. Flames crawling across marble walls, men in suits dragging her away. Her father's last look, angry, desperate, proud, and Cale standing in the blaze like a king who'd won everything. That same king was now her husband. She forced herself not to flinch as he pulled her close for the cameras, their faces locked in a picture-perfect lie. Her dress sparkled, her soul burned. As they walked out of the church hand in hand, rose petals rained down on them like white snow, pure and soft. But Sienna saw them as embers, falling, falling, falling. The black car waited outside. Cale's men in suits lined up like shadows. Reporters screamed their congratulations. Her lips curved into a practiced smile, one she had learned as a mafia princess. But inside, a different vow formed, a silent, poisonous seed. "I will not break beneath you." He opened the door for her like a gentleman, but his gaze was nothing but gentle. It was ownership wrapped in silk. Sienna stepped in, feeling the leather seat close around her like a cage. As the door slammed shut, the world she once knew felt 1,000 miles away. She didn't know if this was the beginning of her destruction or her revenge. But either way, the war wasn't over. It had just moved into her wedding bed.
Chapter 2 Before the Flames. Long before the wedding veil and gunpowder nights, Sienna Vale's world had been made of gold and silk. The Vale mansion sat on the cliffs of Sorel Bay, overlooking an ocean that shimmered like polished silver under the sun. She was 17 when she first saw him. Cale Dravik wasn't wearing a suit then. He was a bodyguard, a silent shadow in black, hired to protect her father's empire. His hands were always in his pockets, but his eyes saw everything. He was older than her, colder too. Back then, she thought he was just another soldier in her father's endless wars. She had no idea he'd be the man to end it all. That afternoon, she had climbed the marble steps barefoot, her hair wind-blown, the smell of orange blossoms in the air. Cale had been waiting by the gates, and for the briefest moment, the ocean had gone quiet. Her pulse had stuttered. She didn't know why. Her father's empire wasn't a business. It was a throne carved out of fear. Men bowed when he entered. Women smiled with tight lips. His word was law in the underworld. Every Sunday, the house filled with men in gray suits, talking in low voices about shipments, territories, and debts. Sienna had grown up at the edge of those conversations, the princess of a kingdom built on blood. But there was a price to that crown. She was never allowed to choose anything. Not her friends, not her future, not even who she loved. She remembered watching Cale from the staircase, his back always straight, his jaw clenched like a man holding too many secrets. He never smiled, not once. But sometimes his eyes lingered on her, just a second too long, just long enough to make her heart trip over itself. One night, rain hammered the glass roof as thunder bruised the sky. Sienna had snuck out of her room, barefoot and reckless, running down to the courtyard where the world felt less like a cage. That's when she found him, Cale, standing alone under the storm, water dripping down his dark hair like a ghost carved from stone. "You shouldn't be out here," he'd said. His voice was low, smooth, dangerous. She smiled anyway. Neither should you. That night something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but a spark, a fragile thread. She didn't know that the same man who made her heart race beneath a storm would one day drag her world into one. That night he gave her his jacket. It smelled of smoke and rain. She didn't forget. The following weeks were slow burns. Glances became longer, words carried weight. She'd find excuses to pass him in the hallways. He'd step aside, silent, but his nearness burned hotter than fire. One evening, her father caught her laughing at something Cale had said, a rare, cracked smile. The room turned to ice. "He's a soldier, not your friend," her father warned. Sienna had lowered her head, but something inside her rebelled. For the first time, she wanted something that didn't belong to her father. She wanted him, not the guard, the man. But Cale pulled away like someone who already knew how this story would end. Every time their eyes met after that, there was a wall between them, made of things unspoken. Sienna didn't know Cale's past. She didn't know that long before he wore her father's crest, her father had burned his. Cale wasn't born into power. He clawed his way up through pain. Behind his silence were graves, and behind his loyalty was rage. That rage wore a mask well. To the world he was a guard, to her father a weapon, but to himself he was something else entirely, the storm coming. The night he placed that jacket on her shoulders, he had already chosen his path. He would burn the empire from the inside, and she, soft, bright, untainted, had become the one thing he hadn't planned for, the girl who made him hesitate before lighting the match. But love doesn't always stop war. Sometimes it only makes the fire worse.
Chapter 3. The Warning in the Smoke. The first sign came on a warm evening in late August. The ocean smelled like salt and honey, and the Vale mansion glowed under a sunset sky. Sienna stood on the balcony, bare feet pressing against cool marble, her silk dress fluttering like pale fire. Cale stood below, near the gates, speaking to men she didn't recognize. They wore black coats,
faces too still, like statues carved out of smoke. One of them passed Cale a small black envelope. He didn't flinch, didn't even look up, but something in the way his shoulders stiffened made her blood run cold. For years, Cale had been her father's shadow, loyal, silent, untouchable. But that night, for the first time, he felt distant, like the tide pulling back before a storm. Sienna leaned over the railing, trying to catch his eye. He didn't look up. He just slipped the envelope into his coat and walked away into the dark. At dinner that night, her father's laughter was loud, almost too loud. The chandeliers trembled with it. "We're untouchable," he said, slicing through a steak as red as blood. The men around the table raised their glasses. "To the Vale Empire!" But Sienna couldn't stop watching Cale at the edge of the room. He wasn't drinking. His hands were behind his back, his eyes locked on something far away. The black envelope was gone. A hollow unease grew inside her chest. When her father finally noticed her staring, his smile faltered. "Keep your head out of shadows, Sienna," he warned, his tone soft but heavy. "This world is not built for soft hearts." She forced a smile, nodding, but her heart was already moving toward the shadow standing at the door, toward him. Later that night, she found him outside, standing by the cliff. The moon was silver and sharp. The wind tasted like salt and secrets. "What was in the envelope?" she asked, stepping closer. Cale didn't turn around. "Nothing you need to know." His voice was colder than the wind. She clenched her fists. "I'm not a child anymore." That made him look at her, really look. His eyes weren't soft like she remembered from the rain. They were storm-dark, fractured, and burning with something she couldn't name. "That's exactly the problem," he said quietly. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the waves crashing below, their roar sounding like a warning she couldn't yet understand. The following days grew uneasy. Men whispered in corners. Her father's smile was all teeth. And Cale began disappearing at odd hours, always returning with cold air clinging to him. Sienna followed him once, just once. It was past midnight, and the halls were empty. She moved like a ghost, silent on the stairs. Cale entered the study, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a map, her father's map. Red marks bled across it, territories, ports, safe houses, and one mark circled in thick black ink, the estate itself. Sienna's breath caught. Her hand covered her mouth before a sound could escape. Cale stood there, staring at the map like a man already living in the fire. She should have turned away. She didn't. She whispered his name, and he froze. Cale turned slowly, like someone standing on a wire between truth and disaster. "How long have you been there?" His voice wasn't soft. It was a blade. "Cale, why are you—" She couldn't finish. Her throat was a knot. His hand slammed the drawer jacket shut, the sound slicing through the room like a gunshot. For the first time she saw it, not the guard, not the man who gave her his jacket, but the stranger beneath the mask. His jaw clenched, his voice dropped. "Go back to your room, Sienna." But she didn't move. Her pulse was screaming. "What are you planning?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He just stepped forward, close enough for her to feel the heat rolling off him. "Some fires," he said quietly, "are not stopped once they're lit." His words hung between them, heavy as smoke. And in her chest, something cracked. Chapter 4. The First Betrayal. The first betrayal didn't come with gunfire. It came with silence. Days after that night in the study, the Vale estate began to feel wrong. Guards whispered in the hallways, deliveries came without names, and doors she'd known all her life were suddenly locked. Sienna moved through the mansion like a ghost inside her own home, her heart never quiet. K.L. avoided her. Every time she entered a room, he found a way to leave. But one morning, as sunlight bled through the tall glass windows, she saw it. K.L. talking to the men in black again, the same ones from the balcony night. This time he wasn't just receiving envelopes, he was handing them out. Papers, blueprints, codes, her father's codes. She froze behind the hedge, the scent of wet grass in her nose, the sound of betrayal pounding in her ears. She didn't need to see the writing to understand. He wasn't just drifting away, he was tearing the foundation apart. That night, dinner felt like poison. Her father talked with his usual arrogance about power, control, how no one could touch him. But Sienna could barely lift her fork. K.L. stood at his usual post near the wall, his face unreadable. But she saw it now, every blink, every stillness, like someone living two lives at once. Her father raised his glass. "To K.L.," he said, "the most loyal man I've ever had." Loyal. The word cut her like glass. K.L. didn't look at her, but she felt the heat of his presence burn against her skin. It was unbearable. She excused herself and fled to the rose garden, the one place that still smelled like something human. The air was cold, heavy. She pressed her hands against the stone fountain and whispered into the dark, "Why?" She didn't expect him to follow, but he did. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking toward a truth too heavy to hold. "Sienna," he said softly. Just her name. It used to make her heart flutter. Now it made her spine stiffen. "How long?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How long have you been lying to him, to me?" K.L. stood a few feet away, moonlight painting his face in sharp silver lines. His silence was the answer. Her breath hitched. "You're going to destroy him, the empire, my father." He didn't flinch. "I'm going to finish what he started. He took everything from me before you ever knew my name." For the first time, Sienna saw the rage behind his calm, the wildfire beneath the snow. "You think burning him will make it right?" she hissed. "It won't bring your past back, K.L." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about the past." His voice cracked like dry wood. "This is about everything he stole, every life he ruined, every piece of me he buried beneath his empire." She took a step back. The boy she once adored under the rain was gone. The man standing before her wasn't holding a match. He was the fire itself, and she was caught between blood and flame. "And me?" she asked, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "What happens to me when you burn it all?" K.L. looked at her then, not like a soldier, not like a lover, like someone already mourning her. "Don't stand in my way, Sienna," K.L. said, his voice low, rough, almost broken. She felt the wind rush between them, carrying the scent of roses and ash. She wanted to scream, to run, to hate him. But the worst part was, she still felt that pull, the ache that had started years ago on a rainy night. "I never stood in your way," she whispered. "You were the one who stood in mine." K.L. closed the distance between them, inches away, his breath warm against the cold night. "Then stay out of the fire." And with that he walked away, disappearing into the shadows that were no longer shadows. They were his kingdom. Sienna stood there, alone, the fountain water trembling at her feet. For the first time she wasn't sure who was more dangerous, her father or the man she loved.
Chapter 5. The Night the Walls Bled. The night it happened, the air carried a weight that Sienna had never felt before. It was thick, damp, restless,
like the house itself knew a storm was coming. The mansion glowed under a bruised red moon, the gardens too quiet, the guards too stiff. Sienna lay awake in her silk bed, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. Then, crack, a sound like bones snapping somewhere in the distance. Another. Then a scream. She bolted upright. The hallway outside her door flashed with the orange glow of fire. Her heartbeat drowned everything else. She threw the door open and was hit by smoke, the thick, choking kind that burns behind the eyes. Men shouted in languages she didn't know. Gunfire cracked like fireworks in hell. Sienna grabbed the rail and stumbled down the corridor barefoot, the marble ice-cold beneath her feet. She had grown up in these halls, but tonight they felt like a maze built to trap her. At the end of the corridor, the grand chandelier was burning. Crystals melted, dripping like blood from a wound. The portraits of her ancestors, a line of men who had ruled like gods, were nothing but ash on the walls. Sienna coughed, her lungs clawing for air. She could hear the heavy thud of boots, Cale's men. She recognized their black coats, the wolf sigil hidden on their sleeves. And in the middle of the chaos, Cale stood like a shadow wearing a crown of fire. He wasn't wearing the guard's black suit anymore. He was in combat gear, no mask, no lies. His hands held a weapon, his voice slicing through the noise. "Clear every floor," he ordered, calm, cold, certain. Her heart fractured. This wasn't a betrayal whispered in the dark anymore. This was war, and he was its king. She stumbled backward, clutching the banister like it could save her. He saw her then. In the middle of his conquest, Cale's storm-gray eyes locked on hers. For a split second, everything froze. The fire, the shouting, the blood. He lowered his weapon, but didn't move toward her. "Sienna," he called. His voice was steady, like the world wasn't collapsing. "Go back." She shook her head, tears cutting through the soot on her cheeks. "You're burning everything," she whispered. He didn't deny it. He stepped closer, smoke curling around him like a beast. "I warned you. This empire was built on stolen lives. I'm just giving it back to the ground." His words were fire. She wanted to hate him, but she could still hear his heartbeat in her memory. Rain, laughter, a jacket on her shoulders, now replaced with war. A gunshot shattered the moment. One of her father's men fired from the balcony. Cale turned, moved like smoke, and returned fire without hesitation. The man fell, blood pooling across the marble like spilled ink. She flinched at the sound, the brutal finality of it. Cale's men surged forward, clearing the hallway. The Vale guards crumbled like old stone one by one. "Where's my father?" she cried, grabbing Cale's arm. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. "You don't want to see him." "You don't get to decide that," she snapped. He looked at her then, not like a conqueror, like a man standing on the edge of everything he couldn't undo. "Then follow me," he said softly. "But understand, once you do, there's no turning back." He led her through the burning halls like a ghost, walking her through her own grave. Every door they passed revealed more of his war, men bleeding, fires devouring walls, the family crest cracking and curling like paper. They reached the throne room. Her father's empire had always begun and ended here, and there he was, Vale and Vale, the Lion of Sorrel Bay, on his knees, blood soaking his shirt, still trying to hold his crown as even the flames chewed it away. Cale stood before him, gun steady, eyes colder than the winter sea. "You finally came to finish what you started," her father spat, coughing blood. Sienna froze in the doorway, her breath ripped from her lungs. Cale turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the flicker in his eyes. Not joy, not triumph, something darker. "No," Cale said. "I came to end what you built on the bones of others." Sienna's world tilted. The walls bled.
and everything she had known cracked in half. Chapter 6. Blood at the Altar. The throne room smelled of iron, smoke, and endings. Flames licked at the curtains, sending sparks floating through the air like dying stars. Valen Vale, once untouchable, now kneeled before the man who had grown in his shadow. Cale stood over him like a dark altar, his gun a priest's blade, his silence a sentence. Sienna had spent her whole life watching her father tower over the world, but now he looked small, broken. Still his eyes burned. "Do it," Valen rasped, blood on his lips. "You've been waiting for this." Cale's jaw tightened, a storm contained inside skin. "I'm not waiting anymore," he said softly. His finger hovered near the trigger, but his eyes flickered. Not at Valen, at Sienna. She stood frozen in the doorway, barefoot, smoke curling around her gown. She wasn't supposed to be part of this ending. But here she was, standing between blood and vengeance. "Don't you dare!" Sienna's voice cracked like a whip through the smoke. Cale's shoulders stiffened. Valen laughed, a sound full of pain and defiance. "Look at you." The dog grew teeth. Cale didn't react, but something in his eyes burned hotter. Sienna rushed forward, the heat from the flame stinging her skin. She grabbed Cale's arm. "If you do this, there's no going back. You're not just killing him, you're killing everything between us." Cale's eyes darkened. "Sienna, everything between us died the moment he burned my home to the ground." Her chest tightened. She had always known her father wasn't a good man, but hearing it like this, seeing it in Cale's trembling fingers, made the truth hurt like shrapnel under skin. This wasn't a war between strangers. It was between the two men who had shaped her life. "Tell her," Cale hissed, his voice finally cracking. "Tell her what you did." Valen's laugh died, his expression shifting into something colder. "You were nothing, boy, a starving rat crawling through the docks." Cale's jaw clenched. "And you burned everything I had because you were afraid of rats." Valen's gaze snapped to Sienna, sharp as glass. "I did what I had to do. Power doesn't wait for mercy." Sienna stared at her father, the world tilting under her. She remembered Cale's words, every life he lost, every bone beneath the empire. "You killed his family," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She saw it in his eyes, a quiet, merciless truth. The foundation she had grown up on wasn't just made of concrete and marble. It was built from someone else's graves. Cale raised the gun again, his hand steady now, no more hesitation. "This ends here." His voice was calm, too calm. Sienna stepped in front of him. "No!" The word was small, but it was enough to make him falter. "Move," Cale said, his jaw locking. "You'll have to shoot me first," she whispered. Her father stared at her with something unfamiliar. Maybe pride, maybe shock, maybe nothing at all. Cale's breath caught. "Sienna, don't do this." Her heart pounded so hard it drowned the fire's roar. "I can't let you become the thing you hate. Not like this." The silence between them was a blade. One wrong move, and it would cut everything apart. Then her father lunged. A knife flashed. Cale reacted without thought. A single gunshot cracked through the throne room like thunder. Valen Vale fell backward, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest like a crimson flower. The flames roared higher, swallowing his legacy. Sienna screamed, dropping to her knees beside him.
Cale stood above them, the gun shaking in his hand for the first time. Valen reached for his daughter with a trembling, bloodied hand. "You were never supposed to love him," he rasped. His breath rattled. And then, nothing. The lion of Sorrel Bay was gone. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was deafening. Cale dropped the gun. It clattered on the floor between them, between what they were and what they had just become. She looked up at him through tears, and he stared back like a man who had set himself on fire.
Chapter 7. The Bride of the Enemy. The ashes hadn't even cooled when the city began to whisper. The lion is dead. The heir has vanished. His killer wears the bride's ring. The world outside the mansion gates moved on, but inside, everything stood still. Sienna sat on the edge of her bed, still in her soot-stained wedding gown. The scent of gunpowder lingered in her hair. Cale hadn't spoken since the night he pulled the trigger. He stood by the window, back turned, watching rain streak down the glass. Every drop sounded like the echo of that one shot. "He would have killed you," Cale said quietly. "You know that." Sienna looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "And now, you've killed him. What does that make us?" His silence was the answer. They weren't enemies or lovers anymore. They were survivors of a fire they both started. The wedding had been planned for power, not love, but now it was a secret binding of blood and consequence. They married in the ruins of Valen Vale's empire, with no music, no witnesses, no joy. The priest who dared to bless them shook as he spoke the vows. Sienna's hands trembled when Cale placed the ring on her finger. It was her mother's ring, one of the few things that survived the flames. "Do you take this man?" the priest asked. Her throat burned as she whispered, "I already have." Cale looked at her then, and for a brief, fragile moment the world stopped burning. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes said what words couldn't. "This isn't a union. It's a truce." And Sienna understood. They weren't walking into love. They were walking into the aftermath. That night, the city's elite gathered like vultures. Some came to mourn Valen Vale. Most came to see the girl who married his killer. Sienna descended the grand staircase in black silk, her veil like a shroud. Whispers followed her like smoke. "That's her, the traitor's daughter, the enemy's bride." Cale stood beside her, a dark silhouette in a tailored suit, his hand resting lightly at her back. A gesture meant to protect her, or possess her. She couldn't tell which anymore. As they passed through the crowd, she felt every stare pierce her like glass. But she lifted her chin higher. If her father had taught her anything, it was this: in a room full of wolves, never bleed. When she raised her glass to toast his legacy, her voice didn't shake. "To my father," she said, "may the fire he started never die." The room fell silent. Later that night, in the quiet of their shared room, Sienna sat at her vanity, removing the veil that still smelled faintly of smoke. Cale stood behind her, reflection cold and unreadable. "You played them," he said. "Every one of them believed your toast." She met his eyes in the mirror. "I didn't lie," she said softly. "I meant it." He frowned. "You still hate him after everything." She turned to face him fully. "I don't hate him," she whispered. "I hate that he made us like this." Cale's expression softened for the first time since the shooting. He reached out, fingers brushing the side of her neck, then stopped himself. "Maybe we were always meant to burn." "Then let's burn beautifully," she replied.
The air between them thickened, love, hate, guilt, all melting into something unholy. By dawn, the mansion had a new name, House Valeon, a merging of their two legacies, blood and fire entwined. The papers called it scandal, the streets called it betrayal, but to Sienna, it was survival. She stood on the balcony, wind lifting her hair as the first light touched the ruins of her father's empire. Cale joined her quietly, his coat draped over her shoulders. "They'll come for us," she said. "Let them," he murmured. "We've already lost everything worth taking." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the boy from her father's war, but the man who bore its scars. Maybe love wasn't supposed to be pure. Maybe it was supposed to be ruin wearing a heartbeat. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was a claim, a confession, and a curse all at once. The city below awoke to a new dynasty, born not of vows, but vengeance.
Chapter 8. The Price of Fire. Power has a scent, smoke, ink, and blood. House Valeon was barely a week old, but its shadows stretched across the city like an unspoken threat. Whispers filled the streets. The Princess of the Ashes has married her father's killer. Inside the mansion, alliances formed in silence and betrayal brewed in whispers. Sienna could feel it in the air, the way servants paused when she entered, the way Kyle's men exchanged glances behind his back. They didn't trust her. They feared her. And fear was always the first step toward rebellion. In the war room, maps of the city were spread across the long oak table, marked with red ink and black knives. "We hold the north and the ports," Kyle said, tapping the map, "but the east is slipping." Sienna watched him, but her mind was elsewhere. The fire they lit together didn't just burn their enemies, it lit the city on edge. Every empire has a price. Theirs was coming. That night she overheard them. In the garden, where the roses still smelled faintly of gunpowder, Kyle's second-in-command spoke in hushed tones. "She's Vale's blood. She'll slit his throat in his sleep." The other laughed darkly. "Or maybe she'll make him weak first. Women like her don't love. They poison slowly." Sienna's nails dug into her palm until it hurt. She could reveal herself. She could scream. But instead she walked away silently, the words planting something dangerous in her chest. Weakness. That was the word they whispered about Kyle. And she was the blade they expected. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong, because as much as she wore the crown beside him, she still carried her father's fire deep inside her. And fire doesn't stay tame. In the great hall, Kyle faced the city's power brokers, men who had once pledged loyalty to her father. Sienna stood beside him, black silk draped like armor. "You're asking us to forget the blood you spilled," one of them spat. Kyle's jaw clenched. "I'm asking you to survive." The tension snapped like glass. Another man, older and sharper than the rest, leaned forward. "What happens when the girl decides to avenge her father? You'll have built your empire on a ticking bomb." All eyes turned to Sienna. She smiled slowly. "If I wanted Kyle dead, I wouldn't wait." A chill spread through the room. Kyle didn't look at her, but she could feel his gaze like heat. She wasn't sure if he was proud or afraid, maybe both. In that moment, Sienna realized something terrifying. She wasn't just part of the empire anymore. She was the empire. Later, on the balcony where they once shared a quiet dawn, Kyle confronted her. "You're enjoying this." She turned to him, the wind playing with her hair. "Enjoying what?" "The fear, the power, watching them bow to you." She met his stare unflinching. "You burned my world down, Kyle. Now I rule what's left. Isn't that what you wanted?" His hands tightened on the railing. "I wanted you beside me, not above me." She stepped closer until their breaths collided. "Then don't build a throne if you're afraid of who might sit on it." His jaw flexed, torn between desire and rage. You're becoming him. No, I'm becoming worse. And deep down, neither of them knew if that scared or thrilled them more. By midnight, the betrayal had a name. One of Kyle's men, his oldest ally, sold their eastern docks to their enemies. A warning shot fired into the night sky, and the city awoke in chaos. War drums began to beat again. Kyle stormed into the strategy room, fury burning like gasoline. Sienna followed silently, her mind already calculating. "We trusted him," Kyle growled, slamming his fist into the table. "You trusted him," Sienna corrected softly. "I watched him." She slid a red pin across the map, marking their next move. Kyle froze, realizing she had already planned the counterstrike. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment he didn't see the girl in the ashes. He saw the queen in the fire. Outside, the city trembled. Inside, their empire sharpened its teeth.
Chapter 9. A Throne of Knives. The first scream split the night like a blade through silk. Sienna jolted awake to the sound of gunfire outside the mansion walls. The rebellion hadn't knocked, it had kicked the door down. Cale's men rushed through the corridors, shouting orders. The air smelled like smoke, gun oil, and betrayal. From the balcony, Sienna saw the docks blazing in orange fire, lighting the city like a funeral pyre. Shadows moved fast, too fast for ordinary raids. This was planned. Precision. Revenge. Cale stormed into the room, shirt half-buttoned, blood already on his knuckles. "It's his men! The traitor opened the gates!" Sienna's heartbeat drummed against her ribs like war drums. She wasn't the same girl who once knelt in ashes. She tightened the strap of her black coat and whispered, "Then we close them." In the war room, the map no longer looked like territory. It looked like a battlefield bleeding red. Cale slammed a pistol onto the table, fury carving deep lines into his face. "We fight back from the west. We cut off their escape route." His voice was fire. Sienna leaned over the map, her voice ice. "No, that's what they expect. We pull the soldiers from the east tunnels and trap them between the bay and the square. No mercy." Cale hesitated. It wasn't her suggestion. It was her tone. Cold, calculated, commanding. Cale said, "Sienna, if you want to keep this throne," she cut in, "you'll follow my plan." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, two storms colliding. Then Cale gave a sharp nod. "Do it." And just like that, the girl who once belonged to the ashes was giving orders to the man who made her kneel. The city square burned like a stage lit for tragedy. Gunfire echoed against marble statues, and the night air shook with the sound of war. Sienna moved through the chaos like a shadow in silk, one step behind Cale, one breath ahead of death. The traitor, Lucan, stood at the bay with his men, smirking like the devil had promised him a crown. "I built this empire with him, and I'll bury it with you." Cale aimed his gun. Sienna stopped him with a hand on his wrist. "Not like this," she whispered. She stepped forward, face illuminated by the burning docks. "You sold us out for scraps. You should have asked me for a throne. I would have given you a blade." The men laughed nervously. Lucan's grin faltered. Because beneath her calm, she radiated something worse than rage. Certainty. The trap snapped like a jaw. Cale's men flooded in from the east tunnels as Sienna predicted, cutting off Lucan's escape. Chaos erupted. The square became a storm of bullets, broken glass, and blood. Sienna ducked behind a fallen column, the stone warm against her cheek from the nearby flames. She saw Cale charging forward, reckless as always, while Lucan's men surrounded him. For a terrifying second, she saw the man who burned her father's empire, about to die in the fire he created. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from choice. She could let fate finish its circle, or she could break it. She raised her gun. One shot.
It tore through the night, clean and sharp. Lucan staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest. His eyes met hers, shock, then understanding. Sienna Valeon had chosen her throne. The battle ended with silence so heavy it felt like the earth itself held its breath. Bodies lay like fallen statues. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying away the last lies. Cale walked toward her slowly, blood streaking his temple, eyes searching hers. "You saved me," he whispered, as if the words burned. "No," she replied softly, lowering the gun. "I saved the Empire." In that moment, something unspoken shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not love. Something darker, stronger. He reached out, and she didn't pull away. Around them, the surviving men knelt, not to him alone, but to her. Sienna had drawn blood for the throne, and the city had seen. A throne of knives was still a throne, and tonight she claimed it.
Chapter 10. Ashes Don't Bow. The sun rose over a city that smelled like gunpowder and grief. Sienna stood on the balcony where everything began, the same place where Kael once whispered promises like smoke, and where she first tasted power in the ashes. Now the city below bowed to no king. The rebellion was crushed, the traitors were silenced. But silence after war isn't peace. It's the moment the ghosts start talking. The survivors whispered her name like both a prayer and a warning. Sienna Valeon, the woman who married the man who burned her father's empire, and then became something far more dangerous than fire. Kael walked out behind her, slower this time, as if the weight of their war was stitched into his bones. "It's over," he said quietly. She didn't turn to face him. "No," she whispered. "It's only beginning." The council room reeked of tension. The remaining lieutenants gathered around the long oak table, their loyalty as thin as the smoke curling from their cigars. Kael sat at the head, but every pair of eyes kept flicking to Sienna. She was no longer the silent bride. She was the storm they had watched rise. "We need order," one man said. "We need a leader who wasn't born from Valeon blood," another spat. The room froze. Sienna's gaze was calm, but her fingers tapped the table. Once, twice, a warning. Kael's hand twitched toward his gun, but she stopped him with the slightest shake of her head. She didn't need Kael's fire. She had her own. "You want a leader?" she said softly. "Then look at the one who ended the war while the rest of you hid in your shadows." No one dared breathe. In that moment, the empire shifted, not because Kael allowed it, but because Sienna took it. Later, in the quiet of the corridor, Kael finally said the words they'd both been choking on. "You've become everything I tried to destroy." His voice wasn't angry, it was broken. Sienna stopped walking. "No," she said, turning to him slowly. "I became everything you created." He looked at her then, not like a lover, not like a king, but like a man staring at the storm he unleashed. "Sienna, what happens to us now?" She stepped closer, their foreheads almost touching. "Us," she whispered. "There's no us on a throne built on bones." His breath hitched. He knew it was true. They were bound by blood and war, not love. And love doesn't survive fire like this. Only power does. The coronation wasn't gilded in gold. It was forged in steel. No silk, no roses, no promises, just the throne, black iron and carved edges, and the city's broken heartbeat echoing outside. Sienna walked through the hall in a simple black dress, her crown a thin circlet of metal, cold as truth. The men who once doubted her knelt without being told. Kael stood to her right, not above, not beside, just behind. The world they built was no longer his, it was hers.
As the circlet touched her head, the empire bent its knee. The girl who lost everything to fire was now the flame itself. She looked down at the faces below, not enemies, not allies, just pieces of a story she had outlived. Ashes don't bow, they rise. That night she returned to the ruins of her father's old estate. The fire had taken everything years ago, but the stones still remembered. She knelt where the old throne once stood, fingers brushing the cracked marble. "Father," she whispered into the wind, "I didn't rebuild your empire, I buried it." The wind carried no answer, just silence, thick and heavy like approval from the dead. She rose slowly, no tears left to give, only strength carved from scars. Behind her, Kael's footsteps stopped at a distance. He didn't follow. He knew this moment wasn't his to share. Sienna walked out into the night, no longer the girl in the ashes, no longer the bride in the shadows. She was the empire, and empires don't kneel. They reign.